We're live? All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our live presentation of Making Things with Milo here from our Spouts plant in Macungie, Pennsylvania. My name is Milo. If you guys don't know, you can check out my videos on our YouTube channel or on our website. I'm a mold maker here and a caster. I also a part of the video department as well as the sales and technical department. So if you guys are not familiar with Spouts, we are manufacturers of silicones, urethane plastics, urethane rubbers, casting materials for all sorts of applications, expanding foams and resins, glues, adhesives. So we cover an entire world of mold making and casting materials across many different industries. Now, today's topic we're going to be discussing is vents, air vents, pour spouts, and keys in two-part block molds. And if you guys are not familiar with any of those terms, make sure that you voice your questions and let us know. Now, let's just set a couple of things straight right from the beginning. Molds are going to be different from a mold maker to mold maker. And even the same mold maker might make the mold differently based on his experience that he made with the first mold that he did on his project. So sometimes you're going to see molds that look great. Sometimes you're going to look not so good, but it doesn't really matter what the mold looks like. It's really important what it produces, what you're getting out of it. Now, with that said, you want to keep in mind the end result. What's the end result? What are we trying to achieve with our project that we're working on? Is it just a mold that we're making for somebody, or is it an entire casting that we're producing for manufacturing? It's always important to understand what the needs are of your project. Now, keeping that end result in mind, you want to understand that every mold and every application is going to be determined by the actual model. And you see here, I actually laid out a couple of models for you to look at. Some of these models you might be familiar with and seen them already. Some are new. So you always want to base your project, your molding and casting approach based on what you're trying to achieve. Are you making a prototype that needs to be rigid? Are you making a flexible foam prop that needs to be soft? Or are you making simply figurines, statues, or even model cars? It's really the determining aspect of your mold making approach. A mold for a statue like this is going to be made with a brush-on material, brush-on application, whereby a mold like this figurine is probably going to be made with a block mold. So already by looking at the model that you're working with, you want to start eliminating the possibilities that are out there. It makes no sense to make a block mold for a large piece like this that you have to handle and it's heavy and you pour material into it. So the right approach is really important. Now, with that said, the approach, you want to keep in mind that the planning is everything. Usually before I start any kind of molding project, I take the object that I'm trying to reproduce and I study it. I study it in depth. I spend a lot of time looking at the model, figuring out where am I going to be pouring from? Where are my high spots? Do I need air vents on this? Which kind of mold is this going to be? Which kind of materials am I going to use? So all that is determined way ahead of the actual mold making. Before any mold making starts, material is mixed. You want to determine what's the approach that you have for that specific model. What kind of materials are we going to pour in that mold? A mold for concrete products is going to be completely different than a mold for casting resin. A mold for casting of low temp alloys is going to be also different, made out of different materials, different vents. So you want to give it as much thought in the beginning before you actually start any kind of mold making. It's going to make your projects a lot easier down the line. Keeping that expectation in mind, what kind of finishing do I need to have on this final piece? Again, keeping the end result in mind is the most important part of your planning of the mold making process and your casting process. Now, once you actually determine, I'm going to make a brush-on mold of this, it's going to be positioned just like this, we're going to pour it from the bottom, get a second opinion. Get somebody else to at least chime in, give you some pointers, some heads up. There's always going to be things that you didn't think of, and somebody might see them differently and see them and tell you, have you thought about these? Or how are you approaching this issue here in your mold? So getting a second opinion on your setup is really good and really important before you get to that stage of mold making where you're just comfortable with just going at it and molding. Now, what are some of the options that you have out there? Well, we actually comprise the entire FAQ section on our website, where you can dive into some of the frequently asked questions that mold makers and casters will have. These questions were answered by our technical department and cover a large spectrum of topics, materials, and issues that people have with their mold making casting. So that's a really good starting point to dive into that and get some information, but there's so much more out there. Beyond the FAQ, we also have how-to videos, so you can watch a lot of videos based on, again, materials that you need to use, the object that you're trying to reproduce, or just a mold type application. You want to see a block mold, how it's made, or do you want to see how a brush-on mold is made? So those are going to be available for your viewing on the video section. Now, beyond our website, you can also reach out to social media groups. They're really great. They're available out there. I joined several of them in order to get a second opinion, or even better, give my opinion to somebody else, because mold makers and casters encounter problems all the time and they need some help. It's a really great way to connect with a lot of people that are going to have at least something to tell you as far as what they are thinking about the project that you're working on. And of course, always make sure you get pictures so that we can see what you're working with and where your troubles are. Now, one more thing I wanted to mention as far as getting a second hand or second opinion help is our world famous tech support. Now, you can choose to give us a call if you have questions about materials, mold making, or you can submit a tech ticket where you can actually attach a picture, describe your project that you're working on in detail, and then one of my coworkers or even myself when I'm on tech support is going to take that project, look at it, and then get you a second opinion as far as the approach that you want to take, the materials you want to consider for this, and at least get a second starting point for where you want to go. Now, again, you're going to hear me say some terms that might not be familiar to you, but as always, you want to ask questions. If you're not familiar with a term or something we're saying, ask a question. You probably already have questions. That's why you're here. And we're here to help you answer those questions. So just so you know how we're handling questions on these live presentations, I have an entire team of Smooth-On coworkers that are actually receiving your questions, and then we'll handle them as they receive them. Some of these questions are more detailed and intricate and require a lot more information, while others are very simple and can be easily answered here on air by me. Now, if you guys do have a question, make sure you voice it. Let us know down in the comments below, and if it does come through here, I'm going to repeat the question so you guys can actually hear it, and then we're going to try to answer it the best that we know. Now, keep in mind, I don't know everything either. We're in a learning process in this world, in this life, and you're going to learn a lot of different things from different people, how to approach things, what tools to use. So don't be limited by your knowledge. Make sure you reach out there and get more information if you feel like you need it. So, with that said, we want to jump in and start talking about some of the subject that we're presenting today, which is going to be on pour spouts, the air vents, and keys. And the first topic is going to be pour spouts. Now, before I jump into that, let me just take a second. I'm going to move some of these models out of the way. So we have a clean working surface. And again, if you guys have questions, make sure you voice them, let us know, and we're going to try to answer them best as we can. Now, if you guys look at our models here, I have this little diver. I'll get these out of the way. So this is going to be our main model that we're going to be focusing on and basically diving into as far as how to go about molding, casting it, and what are the pitfalls and what to look out for and how to handle those. So this is going to be our main model that we're going to be focusing on. And like I said, we're going to be starting with pour spouts. Now, let's just define what a pour spout is. If you think in regular terms, a pour spout is basically a delivery system for casting medium. It allows us to pour a medium, in this case casting medium, into a funnel and deliver it into an open cavity in order to get a solid casting, or sometimes hollow casting. But basically that's what it is. It's that delivery system that allows us to cast something much easier, more efficient, saving material, keeping the working environment clean, basically. Now, some everyday examples of pour spouts that you guys might be familiar with: a simple bottle with a funnel, and when you're pouring into that, the funnel itself becomes that pour spout, delivering the liquid inside that bottle. Another example would be, let's see, a gas tank for your car. So I'm sure most of you went to the gas station to fill up the car. Well, where you're filling the gas becomes the pour spout. That's where you put the handle in. You start pouring the material in, and it channels the gasoline inside a cavity that's called your gas tank. And of course, the gas tanks have a little air vent in order to help them to fill that odd shape, because gas tanks are weirdly shaped, and there's a little air vent that allows you to fill that completely. So in a nutshell, that's what it means to have a pour spout. Now, pour spouts can be a little different from mold to mold. They can be attached directly to the model itself. Again, I'm going to grab some of my models. So here we have a pour spout that's part of the model. The material is poured directly into the bottom of the sculpture. You can see here. Now, this would be considered something like a direct casting because you're directly casting into the model. There's no delivery system for it. You're just casting directly into it, knowing that this is your pour spout, and most likely you're going to do a lot of cleaning work on this pour spout when it's finished coming out of the mold. Now, what's an example of another direct casting? Let's see. I got this little model for you guys here. So we have a very simple block mold, and I'm just going to demold this for you guys. Get this out. And we have our 3 monkeys here. They're pretty monkeys. But the important part is you can see that the pour spout is at the bottom of our piece. So it's directly a part of the casting. And I know that once I cast these, this is going to be where I'm cleaning up. So when I made this mold, that was part of the consideration. I knew that this spot on my casting is going to be hidden. So when it's presented, you can't actually see where the material was cast from. So I don't have to spend a lot of time on this particular piece cleaning it up. So that's something that went into the thought when creating this mold, that it's going to be a direct casting. And just a quick peek inside the mold so you guys see what's going on. Now this is a clear mold that was, it's a block mold that was cut open to get the casting out. Again, direct casting into the object itself. Now let's show you guys a example of an indirect casting mold. Here I have a mold that's actually made by one of our local mold makers. His name is Marty Shamella. He does really exceptional work on molds and castings, very professionally done, very intricate, maybe a little overkill, but really nice mold. It does what it's meant to do, create really good castings. Now, again, indirect casting through a pour spout. Here you can see there's a pour spout area where the material is poured into and then channels into the mold itself. Let's see if I can give you guys a better idea. So here we have an actual pour spout and a little vent attached to it that's actually from this mold. So what he does, he preps these ahead of time. He makes them ahead of time, attaches them to his models. There's a little model that we have, attaches it to the model, and then he molds them like that, already having the pour spout in his setup. Now, I'm going to show you guys this mold again a little bit, but I want to dive into the pour spouts a little bit more. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of pour spouts as well as materials that are used for pour spouts. One thing to keep in mind is not to limit yourself to what's available. You can always make your own things in the mold making and casting world. It's kind of natural to have to fabricate things to fit your specific need. Not every pour spout is going to be same. It's not going to be shaped same. It's not going to be having same size. So keeping that in mind, you can use many different objects, many different materials to actually make these pour spouts. And some of them are pre-made in molds, and some of them are actually made as you go. Now, again, some of the products you can use, we have here oil-based clay. This is Sculptex. This is a oil-based clay that's friendly to any silicone and will not inhibit. It's a great product to have in your toolbox because you can use it for many different things. It does come in a soft, medium, or hard. And I prefer the soft, even though this is a medium, I prefer the soft when I'm working with claying up molds, whereby the hard I prefer when I'm sculpting models. Here another example, this is a simple ball made out of wood. But what you can do with that is make these really nice pour spouts. So here the same thing, a ball was taken, cut apart, and then a dowel was inserted, creating a pour spout area and a delivery system for setting up any kind of model. I can now take this, set it up, put my model on top, and I have my pour spout set up. So this is a wooden example. Again, here's a plastic example that was pre-made. You can make these out of metal, wood, clay that we already mentioned, but you can also make them out of other everyday objects. So here I want to show you guys, this is a plastic syringe. Again, something you're going to find in a mold maker's toolbox. They come in different shapes and sizes. But what I really like about them is this tip here, because it can be used really good for a pour spout application. And I want to show you guys quickly an example of that.
Before you do that, Bill, can I ask a quick question?
Sure, we got a question coming in.
Yeah, somebody was asking about the mold of the
Right.
like the fossil. So all the air vents out of the pour
Right.
spout for that?
So yeah, that's a good question. So we have a question asking, does all the air vent out of the through the pour spout? And as a mold maker, you'll find in your learning process that attaching the air vent to the pour spout is actually something that's commonly done. So I'm going to demold this piece so you guys can get a better visual. Let me get a detail shot on his here, right here. So you can see that the air vent that's at the tip, the highest point of our casting, is directly connected to the pour spout. Does that mean that every time we pour, let's turn this upside down, so every time we pour into the pour spout, there's material going into the air vent? Not really, because this is at the very tippy tip of the pour spout. So we're actually pouring the material into the pour spout. It's getting channeled into the casting by gravity. It doesn't have time to go down this little tiny air spout. So it's going to fill up through the big cavity first, and then the excess air that rises is going to shoot up through the air vent. So while some mold makers will attach them to their pour spout, again, it's something that you learn in your mold making approaches, and the more you do these things, the more you understand how things work, and you may want to place the pour spout and the air vent closer to each other, attach them to each other. It's not unseen to have something like this. I've seen this many times. I've done it myself. I actually show you the figurine that we're working on is going to have the air vent attached directly to the piece itself. I'm going to show you guys that in a little bit. But keep the questions coming. That was a good question. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we approach the air vents. Now, I did want to show you the syringe method that I used on this mold, particularly here. So this is a mold for my tiny little model tires. So here we have 2 castings out of that mold. Can you guys see that? This one has the air vent and pour spout attached to it. This is a finished casting. Small pieces, but really important for what we were doing, the project I was working on. And I wanted to make a gang mold for this. Knowing that these pieces are very small, a lot of detail, and possibility for air trapment, I wanted to make sure that I inject into the mold. So starting the project, I already determined that it's going to be injected with one of these syringes. So what I did in my mold setup, when this first part of the mold was made, I literally suspended the syringes above the mold, a couple of them, boop, 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 to create these voids. Now, when my mold is finished, that syringe fits perfectly into that port. So I can easily get my material, squeeze it into the port, squeeze it in until the air vents are completely filled and material shoots out. And just so you guys see that what's going on in this mold, this is a 3-part block mold, a little bit more intricate, but nothing crazy. Here's the bottom half. I'm going to just show you that the entire surrounding here, that's actually a key, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's the actual castings. So they're in the middle section of my 3-part mold. You can see I already removed some, and most of them are still in there. But I wanted to make a gang mold that's injected with a syringe and create a nice clean pour spout on the top half of our mold. And here you can see, again, a little detailed shot. Thank you. This is what the piece looks like that comes out of that pour spout once it cures. So it has that syringe definition. So that's one type of pour spout. Keep in mind that you can make all kinds of different pour spout, all kinds of different sizes. It's really important, again, keep that end result in mind. What are you trying to achieve? And most of the time, we want to kind of minimize any kind of cleanup efforts. So keeping that in mind is really important for these kinds of setup. Now, some of the pour spouts themselves sometimes actually have to carry weight, and clay might not be the best option, but there's other everyday objects that you can use for the pour spouts. So here I have an example that I set up. This is the same model again, but check this out. There's actually a ratchet piece in there. This is a socket from a ratchet that's hollow. So again, it has that nice funnel shape. And why I chose to use this, it's hollow. And I knew that I wanted to attach my model, you go over here, I wanted to attach my model firmly to the working surface. So I put a screw through it, going through the socket itself, and then screws into the model, gripping onto the model firmly. Now this setup here is specific to minimize the pour spout footprint in order to minimize any kind of cleanup effort that we're going to be doing on this casting. But the same model you can see was here set up on a clay pour spout where the entire bottom of the figurine becomes a pour spout. So there's a piece that doesn't have to carry weight. It can just sit like that. You can make a mold. You can embed it halfway into the clay, and it'll still be the same setup. Now, you might ask a question, well, what if I want to minimize the footprint on the sculpture that we're working? So you don't want a big pour spout like that, but you want a smaller pour spout. You want to go with something like this, but you want to still clay it up. So here I have a setup where the pour spout itself is touching only one corner of the figurine. So basically what we have is same setup, but different way. So this is two-part clay up. This is freestanding and attached to the sprue. But at the end of the day, it's the same mold kind of fabrication. This is going to be a one-part block mold, cut open on the side. This is a two-part block mold that's probably going to be, is already keyed, but we're going to add some more keys to it as well. So again, same application, just a different setup. So you can see that different mold makers, or even the same mold maker, is going to approach a subject like this in different ways based on the outcome that he's trying to achieve. Now, I did prep a couple of models for you guys. Here is a shark tooth, and this one we used a clay pour spout and a clay air vent that we made. Now this was actually a video that we shot a while ago, so if you guys want to check out this video in particular, how it was made, you can go to the links below the description, and there's going to be a description for a shark tooth video, so you can see that, how it was made. I'm just going to open the mold so you guys can see into that. Really nice to work with these clear molds because you can actually see into them as you're casting. You can faintly see the outline of the model in there.
Milo, before you go further,
Yes.
Someone is asking about the size of the vents, like on the shark tooth.
Right.
How do you determine how big the vents are on a piece?
So the question here is, how do you determine how big the vents are on your piece? Now, I'm not sure if we're talking about the pour spout here or the actual air vent, but not to get ahead of ourselves, we'll talk about air vents specifically. Keep in mind that bigger air vents allow more material to pass through them, which means more air escaping, but more importantly, you're not going to put the same air vents on a large mold that you're going to put on a small one. And what I mean by that specifically, I'll show you right here. So here I have another setup that I did. This is for a ring mold. You guys can see that. You have your pour spout here. You have your pour spout, you have your delivery method, and then you have a little air vent on the side there. Now, it would have not made sense to use an air vent this thick on that little of a piece. So a small air vent was used there. But again, there's going to be more to the air vent topic that we're going to talk about, specifically sizes that we're going to dive into. But good question there. Sticking with the pour spouts for right now, let's move this mold out of the way. couple other examples of pour spouts that are prefabricated. This right here is a block mold that we made for casting of food grade materials. So this was made for lollipops. Again, another video that you can check out down in the description below. You're going to see the link to that. But the reason why I brought this up, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but these here, they're the pour spouts for our mold. And right there, you can see that there's actually a funnel going down into it. I'm going to open this so you guys can see even better, or not. Basically, what these were, they were little cones similar to a syringe cone that we set up our models on, knowing that when we go to cast into this mold later on, we wanted the larger funnel to be able to easily and successfully pour the molten material into the mold. So a lot of thought went into the design of the mold before actually starting the mold out and setting the models up. But again, if you guys want to see the making of this mold and how the pour spouts were set up on this, check out the link down in the comments section below. Again. Now, if you guys have questions, again, make sure you keep voicing them out. We're going to answer the questions as we go along. Don't feel like you're not going to get an answer to your question. If you do not get an answer to your question because it's too big, the question was too large or too difficult, too intricate, make sure you send us a tech ticket where one of our techs or even myself is going to respond to that. This morning I received a tech ticket asking about air vents because of our presentation today. About a hand. There's a model of a hand, and my customer wanted to know, do I need to put air vents along the fingers down here to make sure we get a good casting every time we cast into it? My approach to it was no, not necessarily, because you're casting directly down into it. There's no area where air bubbles are going to get stuck easily, but I gave him a second opinion. I said you can make a air vent that goes down and touches all the fingers and comes up on the sides to get a good casting on the fingertips. It's something that I readily see in the resin casting world where you're dealing with very small detailed fingers and stuff like that. So make sure that you voice those questions out. Let us know and we'll get back to you with some answers. And if we don't know the answers, we'll get the answers for you. All right, so now we're going to move on, get some of these out of our way. Next thing we're going to talk about are those air vents. And like that question that came in earlier, it's really nice asking, what size air vent do I need for my model? Well, that should be really determined early on in the mold making process. So it goes back to thinking and planning ahead of what are you casting? Because I can tell you, concrete can't go through a small, tiny air vent that's the size of my pinky. It just can't. It's too thick. So keep that in mind as you ask yourself those questions. Now, what are air vents? Air vent definition is basically air escape, an evacuation route for a casting medium. And why you need air vents? Well, if you don't have air vents, you end up with castings that have voids. And here I'm going to show you guys, make sure. So here's the same figurine that we're working on. And you can see that here there is an arm missing. And that's because there is no air vent to let the material rise to the top there. So that's something that can happen in your casting easily and throughout the casting based on the complexity of it. And I did put a little example graphic for you guys that you can see what's actually happening inside that mold. So while we're pouring the material into the mold, now this is a mold that has no air vents. You can see where the air bubbles are going to accumulate. This is where you most likely will get a air bubble trap and a failed casting. Now, is everything lost at this point? No. You can always go back and fix your problem. In a soft silicone mold like that, it'll be much easier. But let's just see the other graphic as far as what would happen with air vents in your mold. So again, the same figurine, pouring same material into it, but now because of those air vents, we're able to fill those arms nicely, allowing the air to escape upwards and out of the mold itself. So here you can see clearly where those green lines are. Those are my air vents that are allowing the material to shoot upwards. But again, this is going back into keeping in mind your application, your approach, and your end result in mind. You want to plan for these things ahead of time before you actually get to the point of casting failed castings. Again, you can remedy some of these, not having to make an entirely new mold, but sometimes it's better to actually go back and make a new mold because you're going to determine these things much better learning things. Now, how to determine where to put your air vents. Again, going back to our little figurine. So I spent some time studying this piece before I started molding it. And once I determined how I wanted to mold it, so which direction the material is going to be poured into the mold, I decided that's going to be upside down. So this is how we're going to pour the piece. I immediately recognized that this hand right here, as well as the other hand, this hand right here, are high points. These are the points where the air is going to want to trap. So knowing that, I already planned that I'm going to be venting this upward. Now, in my setup and in the graphic that you guys saw, I vented this piece directly to the base. I wasn't concerned about it touching the base. I wasn't concerned about the finishing I had to do, so I just connected it to the base itself. Going back to that question that you guys asked earlier about is that attached directly to the pour spout? Yes. So in this case, again, it was directly attached to the pour spout. Here's a casting example with the air vents. And you can see that they're directly connected to the pour spout, to the bottom of the figurine. Now, I planned for this knowing that I will have to cut these off, remove them, and then have to clean that area where they came off. So again, going back into that planning stage, these are things that you want to keep in mind, because guess what? Now that adds more time to my finishing process of this piece. And if you have to make 2,000 of these, that might be a problem there. So keeping the end result in mind, really important when you go to cast and set up your projects.
Hey, quick question, Milo.
Yes.
Why would the vent on that diver go to the knife hand,
Right.
but not to the elbow as well? I mean, would you have to do one in the elbow in this case?
So the question here is, why does the air vent go to the knife here and not to the elbow? And it's a really good question. It becomes really tricky, and the answer to that is it's your choice. If you discover that in your casting procedure that you're trapping a lot of air in that elbow, guess what? All you have to do is cut that vent to this, from the elbow to that vent, and you have your issue solved. Now, what's another way to solve that issue is the way that you set up your piece, the way that you set up this piece for casting. I'm just going to grab my little model here. So here we have a setup, right, that's angular. It's not flat, it's not straight. Let's put this upside down. So this one, we're trapping air in the elbow. That's the problem that we're having. This one, let's turn this upside down. The elbow is now, there you go. So the elbow is now going to be more at an angle, let's see, like that. causing it not to trap air in that. So it's really important how you set up that model to deal with those difficult areas. However, again, if you discover that you're having problems there and you didn't do the right setup or orientation of your piece, you can always add additional air vents after the mold is made. So if you discover in your casting you're having voids in that elbow, you can always cut an additional vent, especially if you're working with a silicone mold. Even if you're working with rigid molds, you're still going to be able to alter them afterwards, adding air vents, making the pour spout bigger. All those things you can do down the line, even if you didn't think of them on time. But again, it's better to plan ahead. Same thing goes for your summer vacation, right? It's better to plan ahead than being stuck somewhere not knowing what to do or what needs to be done. Now, let's just examine a couple of materials that are used for air vents. You can use anything simple like wood dowels. These are really easy to source, available in many different thicknesses based on the model that you're working with, and very inexpensive. So they are a definite go-to. So here you have examples of a thin one and a thicker one based on the model that you're going to be working with. Along the same lines of the dowels, one of my favorites, toothpicks. Toothpicks are great for very small objects when you're working on detail. They're easy to cut and fill in. And here I also have one more thing. Get this. There's a little needle. These are used usually in sewing when I'm sewing my clothes, but I also use them in my mold making. This particular piece, needle, was used for the tire mold, for the little tire molds. So here we have, again, just to show you guys, a little tire mold. The vents inside the tire mold, this is really hard to see here, but the vents, can we get a close? Thank you. So you can see the vent there, the little pinhole, that is actually created by that needle. So I use that needle as my air escape. And that leads me directly into talking about, and keep the camera there, I want to show these guys what's going on in these molds. So if you look here, we have two pinholes. There's a larger and a smaller one. The larger one is delivery of material, the smaller one is the air vent. Now, why would I do a small air vent like that? So what happens in air vents is that air is forced out of them. If you think about our graphic, the material is filling up and it's pushing that air somewhere. If you don't have the air, it just gets trapped in your mold. But when you have air vent and it's small, it's forcing and pushing the air out of it, basically creating pressure in that mold. A thinner, smaller air vent is going to actually put more force on the material, on the air to shoot out of the air vents, whereby larger air vents are just going to allow more air to escape or more material to fill that cavity, that void. So if you discover that your air vent is not sufficient, it's not large enough, you can scale that up. And I'll show you a couple of ways that I do it in my molds. Now, a couple other things that are used for air vents, really basic things like lollipop sticks. A lot of people have plastic sticks like this around. They come in different durometers, different thicknesses. Sorry, got my terms there mixed up. Here's a plastic straw, and these come also in different thicknesses or radiuses. There's some that you can bend. They have that little nick to bend them, making them easier for air circulation. Beyond that, you're going to also find that in different industries, they're going to use different air vents. So I want to show you guys really quickly. This is a two-part block mold that I made when I started here at Smooth On years ago. This is made for venting or for making more vents, making dowels. Here I have different thicknesses dowels, and here's my pour spout, and I pour these out of wax. So I pour wax in here, it fills the cavities and produces thinner and thicker dowels that I can then use for my air vents. Something like this you're going to see in the bronze casting industry a lot. The art casting, lost wax industry is going to make those and use them. What I like about the vents that are made with wax is that they're softer. You can easily manipulate them into difficult to reach areas. You can easily use a soldering iron and you melt the tip of the air vent to attach it to your model, creating a nice tight connection there. So nice little things that you will discover with different materials you're using. Most of the times you're going to be using a hot melt glue to attach things to your model. Sometimes you're going to be using RC glue. So all those things are available to you, and don't limit yourself just to one. Make sure that all of them are in your toolbox that you can easily access and use depending on what you're working with. Now, here's something I want to show you guys that's might be a little bit more of a professional thing to do or when you have issues, but this is brass rod and it's telescoping. It has different thicknesses in it. I'll slide these out, you can see them. So if you can zoom in on that. Thank you. And you can see they're different thicknesses, and there's actually quite a bit more of them in here that I could get out if I needed to. Now, what would I use something like this for? If you are making a mold, a larger mold, and you discover there is an area inside the mold that's not really on the two halves where the mold comes together, and you might need to punch through the silicone air vent to get the air out of that spot, this is something that you would use for that. A couple of molds that I used this on was the steering wheel mold. I used that here. There was a air bubble trapment in my steering wheel casting, and I wanted to get it out. So my regular air vents were just not enough, and I needed to go deeper in the back. So I ended up punching this mold way back here. There's a little air vent. I don't know if you guys can see that, but you can use these tools to make better castings. So don't limit yourself to one single thing. Make sure that you use different things, see what other people are doing, and then employ those things in your molds and castings. So really easy things that you can do with air vents. Now, I do want to show you a couple more examples here, of course. We talked about clay and how to use clay for your air vents. So here is our basic setup of our little diver that we made earlier. You guys can see that. There's no air vents here. It's just clayed up. I have my pour spout built in, but I know that I need an air vent going down from that hand and then one from this hand here. So again, digging into our toolbox, we could use wood dowels, but I wanted to show you guys how I use the clay to make my vents. So I'm just going to set this up here. I'm sure you guys can see that. And basically what I did is I rolled out some clay into a little snake, and I'm simply going to apply it to the spot where I'm trying to channel the air from. Press that down into the clay and out to the top of our mold. Now, this is just sitting on the clay right now the way it is. It will allow material to go underneath that clay. So what I do is take a little tool and then flatten that somewhat. You can flatten the edges. Creating a nice tight seal around that clay up.
Milo, while you're doing that,
Yes.
a question came in about whether it's a benefit to attach the air vent to the pore area versus it having its own hole like you're doing there.
So we have a question about, is it better to attach the air vent to the pore area, or is it better to vent it straight up to the top of our mold? And the straightforward answer is, it's up to you. I find it that I like my pour spouts to be on the sides of my molds, on the top here. Some of you might discover that you like them to be attached to the pour spout, just like my friend Marty did with his little pour spout and air vent here. So again, this goes back into the everybody's a little different category. You know, I'm not going to make the same mold as you're going to make it, and my coworkers here are not going to make the same mold that I'm going to make. They're all going to be a little bit different. Is one better than the other? I don't know. The only answer is, are you getting good castings out of that mold? Or are you getting air bubble trapment? Is material going down that air spout? So that will be the determining factor. Are you getting what you want out of that mold? I'm not going to tell you that one is better than the other, because my coworker here does one thing and my other coworker does another. I like them both, and I take from both of them and employ it in my molds and my castings, my setups. So when I had actually an issue with one of my molds that I was working on, I wasn't sure of the approach and how I was going to handle something, so I got 3 different people to give me their opinions. And then I went right down the middle of the road, took a little bit of each one, and made what worked for me. So that's pretty much the simple answer. I hope that helps, by the way. So again, we have our little pour spout that we put on here, and that's made out of clay. You can also, again, use wood dowels. Simply press them into the area where you desire them to be. There it is. So one is made out of wood, the other one's made out of clay. Serve the same purpose. Which one you're going to employ? Again, it's up to you. You're the, you're the decider. Anyways, you're going to have the choice where to put those, and it's going to be up to you. You might find that one thing works better for you than another thing, and you're going to stick to it. I have tendencies to stick to things that I learn that work for me. I try not to change my my approach to things that I know work perfectly. So which one you end up using, it will be determined by you, but also right back to the beginning, it will be determined by the model and how you set it up. So all that goes into successful mold making and casting and the layup of your mold. So again, there you have a simple way to add air vents to the layup that you did, to the setup of your model. Now, what happens if you, let's say, make the first half of your mold and you totally forgot air vents, you forgot keys. Now you have a piece of mold basically that has just a flat, clean area. This is not good for alignment. It's not good for air vents. Obviously, you don't have any air vents. But again, it's not the end of the world. So if you remember, we talked about cutting air vents into your mold, and this would be a great example of how that is done. Now, I will start cutting into that in just a second. I did want to show you a sample of that. So here we have a prop hammer made out of foam with a bolt and a nail, railroad spike, and basically the way that this mold was set up in a two-part is using alginate. And just like our other molds that I use for examples, you can find this in the description below and check out the whole video. See how I went about making this mold, creating the keys, creating the air vents into it, also the pour spout. But just to run over it really quickly, the models themselves were sunk halfway into alginate. So we set them up perfectly halfway, poured the alginate, and that became our separator. So instead of spending an hour of claying it up with oil-based clay, we used alginate in that specific application. And once the alginate was cured, we went back into it and we actually cut the pour spout, we cut the air vents, connected the models here with the air vents and allowing the material to move in and up and out. And then we added the keys as well into that alginate. We added keys to the side here. You can see these being cut out. See that? It's not just a straight line, but actual cutout there. There's another one here in the corner. So those are added into the alginate halfway into the process. So again, planning ahead, keeping the end result in mind. I made this mold knowing that this is going to be the application, that I will be pouring it halfway and then cutting these out. So go onto our YouTube channel or our website and check out how I made this mold and added those into it. Once you cut them out and you pour your silicone over that alginate, you're actually then capturing everything you cut out in solid silicone. Once you turn the whole thing over and you pour the other side, now that other side is going to come out with the positive pour spout, with the positive keys, with the positive air vents. This is hard to see here because it's clear, but basically what you do is you cut those then off, creating the hollow spaces that you need for the air vents. Again, if you want to see this in detail, and I strongly recommend it because it's different, it's a different kind of application, I would recommend you checking this out on our video. Now, let's just go ahead and cut some air vents into this mold. So again, we set this up earlier. Turn it this way and get some of this out of the way. And keep those questions coming, guys. It's really nice to hear what other people thinking about and have issues with, or what they want to clarify for their mold making processes. Now, again, we're going to be cutting air vents into this. And for that, I like to use my razor blades. And specifically, I want to show you guys these three here, my three hook blades. If we can zoom in on that, please. Now, I made these myself specifically for cutting of air vents. I used a blowtorch, heated up the blade on these, and then bent them to my liking. I can make larger air vents, medium, or small. Right? And for this mold, because it's so small, I'm going to use the smaller one. Put my blades back here into my silicone pillow. And so you guys see, I'm going to use that hook blade now to carve air vents into the desired areas. Simply going to follow up until you reach the top of the mold. But keep in mind, you have the main channel now, so there's your main channel. Right at the tip where you're pushing the silicone, that's not going to cut very easily, so you just go back in and widen that a little bit. So there's my air vent to that hand. Now we're going to do one on the other side, and here you can see a nice little ridge. That doesn't matter, we can simply follow the ridge I'm going to start on the other side and work my way towards the model. Going up the ridge. And that's how you're adding additional or just adding air vents, period, into molds that don't have them. So there you have it, a very easy way to add additional air vents. Now let's say I already had a vent there. Remember that question in the beginning about that elbow? So now we can address that elbow. You know what, I cast it into this mold, it didn't cast well there, so this elbow is a problem area for me. I'm going to add an additional vent from that elbow right into the other air vent.
Milo,
Yes, sir.
when you bent those exactos, did you just use a standard propane torch?
So the question here is, when I bent these blades for the knives that I make, for my key knives and my air vent knives, I just use basic torch. If you guys want to see how they're made, there's actually a video, again, down in the description below. There's a video on how to make your own mold knives. If you haven't seen that, check it out. It's really interesting because it goes further into the making your own tools and not just being limited to what's out there, what's available. We will talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but here, just a quick peek. I couldn't resist. Here is a mold knife that we purchased. You can see that groove. Let me put that over. Visible? You guys can see that? So there's a groove in that blade. And that creates a key as we're cutting into any kind of silicone. But you can make your own. These blades are quite expensive, so check out the video that shows you how to make your own mold knives. But more importantly, you can make all kinds of other tools. Just like I made these tools for my air vents. Same way you can make other tools. I don't only use these tools for my air vents, I also use them for my keys. And I'll show you how to cut keys into this as well in just a minute. Again, keep those questions coming, guys. It's really interesting to see how you guys think and the information that you guys are inquiring about. So again, I added that additional air vent here from that elbow that we had an issue with. If you guys remember the question earlier, I was getting air bubbles in my elbow here. So how I can remedy that is by adding additional vents. So now, before I go on to the next topic of keys, I actually want to start with this mold right here because we are going to be making a second half of it. And before I proceed of making the second half, I wanted to go ahead and show you how I cut keys into this mold. So I'm going to use one of the larger blades, hook blades that I made. And now I'm going to basically put a key around the model itself that's going to help the mold register. You want to keep these keys about 1/4 of an inch, plus minus, to the model. They don't have to be continuous. You can stop. There's one, and then continue. Here's my other one. I'm continuing going around the model, creating keys that are going to help register this two-part mold that we're making. And this is going to connect one to the other. And a couple more keys on this side. I'm not sure if you guys seen some of the molds that I make, but sometimes they are full of keys. I mean, there's keys inside of keys. The keys themselves make the alignment of the mold much better, much easier. which again, on the other side, is going to produce better casting, minimizing any kind of flashing that we're having on that casting and minimizing post-finishing work on that casting. So I don't want to say you can't have enough keys, but usually the rule of thumb is having more keys is better. Now you see here I have two flat areas that have nothing in it, and if you think back of the prop hammer video, we saw those keys on the sides. Here I want to show you guys how I cut some keys into the side. Again, simply razor knife. And I wouldn't make them too large, just that. And basically what we're doing is we're creating a uneven area where the two halves of the mold are going to be registering into. You can go right back into with your hook knife. I'm going to cut these right to the end here. So there you go. So now we have not only a mold that has air vents that we added, but also keys, rendering this mold useless. Rendering this mold useful again, not useless. Anyways, so I'm going to set up this for a pour of the other half. I'll stick my knives into my silicone pillow so nobody gets hurt. And I'm going to basically put a mold box around this to pour the other half. But in the meantime, I do want to throw out a couple more examples at you guys so that you're understanding better of what's going on with the keys inside our mold. And here's a couple examples I set up. So here we have, first off, I wanted to do this really quickly. So here I have a two-part mold. This is a cross-cut of a mold, but it really clearly shows you what's happening with those keys inside your mold. They're aligning perfectly together so that we can get a better casting. There's not going to be any flashing along this line here. And now we're going to open this to see what's going on inside. And you have your negatives of the acorn nuts that we used, and then you have your positives. Here on the side, this is a key that was cut out of clay. And I'm going to show you how that's done as well in just a second. So we have a key cut out of clay, and remember that key inside a key? Oh, there it is. There's your key inside a key. Can we zoom in on that? It's really interesting. Oh, sorry. So let me see if I can get that. There you go. So we have our key that was a positive, and it registers here as a positive. And then inside it, there's another key that registers as a negative and a positive over here, making this a perfect fit. See how that comes together and doesn't move? Whoop.
What is that, Milo? Is that mold star you tinted?
This here, question came in, is this Mold Star? Yes, this is Mold Star, one of my favorite products to work with. Low viscosity, easy one-to-one mix ratios. This is regular color that you're going to see the material in. It's that tealish blue. This one I tinted with green, and to tell you the truth, I think this one I was actually Mold Star 20T. So this one was clear, and I was able to add different color. And the reason why I did this is just to show you guys a contrast between the two halves and what's happening inside the mold. But really good example as far as how keys work inside the mold. So basic alignment tool that creates better castings, minimizes any kind of post-finishing, any flashing that comes in your castings. And just jumping into a couple other examples that we have set up of these. Here is a heavily keyed mold. I want to show you guys that. This is a 3-part mold, a 2-part block mold with a plug in the center that produces these objects. I think this is a candle holder. But really interesting what's going on. We have these keys that are really nicely locking the two halves of the mold together. But more importantly, what I wanted to show you guys is this cross section right here. I can see if I can get a good camera angle on that. Thank you. So you can see that there is keys sticking out. You can see behind my finger. They're pointing one way, and these here are pointing basically in the same direction, that way and that way. This was done on purpose. These are interlocking keys. They actually hold something in place. And what that is this plug right here. Thank you. So those keys hold this plug in the center so that we can create these castings that are hollow. I'm sorry about the white casting. I know this blows up on your screen, but they're hollow. And I'm going to pull this out so you guys actually can see what's going on inside that mold. So again, they're held in place. Look how nicely that's held in place. It's not coming out unless we pull these apart. Now the keys are releasing that plug. We can easily now demold our casting. And you can see our pour spout, air vent, pour spout, some flashing, pour spout, air vent. And now we can remove that. So we have our hollow casting. The air vents and pour spouts easily removed. Post finishing on this piece is going to be on the sander, belt sander. Done. Next. So keeping in mind, I decided to put the air spout, the pour spout, and the air spout at the bottom where they're hidden from the viewer and easy to finish once the piece is casted. And just here again, so you guys can see clearly, here's my plug. And this is a MoldStar 30 mold, 30 durometer. And the plug itself, you can see how it's keyed. And notice there's a different number of keys on each one of these. It's like a dice. And the reason for that is that they're orientational keys. So not only do they hold the piece in place, but they perfectly register. Let me see, you guys. So here we have 6 keys sticking out, while the opposite side has 5. So on my plug, I find a 5er and a 6er. And I know that this piece goes in every time that way. Now I can go ahead and close the 2 pieces together. And there's my mold. And you can see because of that, the mold, even though it's heavy, it holds quite well onto the 2 halves. So a really nice example of a plugged keyed mold, block mold. Now keep the questions coming, guys. We're gonna cruise through this topic, but I'm gonna try to answer as many questions as possible. Move some of these models aside. There's a couple other keys that I want to talk about and mention and show you guys, because keys can be made out of many different things. Again, Sculptex comes to mind, and going back to our little diver here, we already prepped this in clay. You can see I already keyed this heavily on one side, and you notice there are smaller keys. They're about a 1/4 inch away from the model, the smaller ones. On this side, I have nothing. We left this blank on purpose. I wanted to show you guys a couple of ways that you can go ahead and key those in. So my basic go-to key would be an acorn nut on a screw. Let's see if right there, that's good. And keep in mind that these come in different sizes. So depending on the size of your mold and what you're trying to key, you use one or the other. I'm going to go in the middle of the road here. Actually, I'm going to go with the small one. And basically what you do is you take your key and you start keying your mold. Again, keeping the larger keys a little bit further away and the smaller ones a little bit closer. Very easy, very simple to make those keys right there. Now, switching tools, this is a ball tool with a ball at the end. Put it up against my apron, you guys can see. So different sizes available. This is a smaller one, smaller even. And again, going right back into that clay up, pressing that right in, turn it a few times, pull it out. And smaller keys you want to keep closer to your model, while the bigger keys are further away. Now, this is not the only tool that I use for keys. I also like to use sculpting tools. I have one right here. I want to show you a couple other examples of ones. So you have different shapes, but they serve the same purpose. You can easily carve into your piece with one of these that creates a groove and a channel. So I don't know if, let me use this one because it's a little larger, you guys can see. This is a sculpting tool that I use for keying. And the same thing here, just smaller version. And what you can do is simply cut into your clay, follow your model, and then you remove that clay, we'll wipe. Now that creates a void where we're gonna pour silicone into. There you go, that's a good angle. So once that is poured, that becomes a positive, and then when the other side is poured, becomes a negative, making them interlock perfectly together. These keys can be a little different, again, based on the tool that you use. They can be also made to interlock, just like the last mold that we showed you. And what I mean by that, a quick example, and we'll get back to this in a second, is this little mold that I made for these RC car tires. These are rubber tires that we made for one of my RC cars. But the mold design was a little different. And this is, again, a 3-part block mold. Nothing fancy here, except the keys. Check this out, guys. So I can hold this mold one half or the other half. It doesn't come apart until I open it. And that's the tool that I just used. So let's see. So this little guy was used to cut these keys into clay. Because it has a bevel to it, it has a V shape or cone, now the positives interlock into those perfectly, gripping onto the other key and holding it in place. Now, if you guys follow this mold here, there's one key that's a little different. Yeah. There's a little acorn nut that was pressed into the clay, and there's the negative of it. That is called an orientational key. What's an orientational key? It's something that allows you to quickly put your mold together, not trying to find out, well, which way does this go together? No, it's always the same way. There's one, there's the other. They find each other, you aim for them, and the mold always goes back easily together. Same thing as far as directional keys with the last mold we show you, having 5, 6 keys on one side versus the other, it's going to help your alignment much better. So very simple mold, but interestingly keyed so that the two halves stay together. So a couple other keys I want to show you real quick before we move on. Cutting keys. So if you have a flat shape like this, you can always cut and make this irregular to create a section that the mold is going to register in much better. I'm going to do this really quickly just so you guys get the idea of it. This is what I call step keys or terraces keys. Again, this is a term that probably only I use. Different mold makers are going to call these different things. nothing is set in stone saying you can call them only one way. And then I come back with my little sculpting tool to clean up those edges. And now that becomes a key that helps me register those two halves of the mold. So you see how that from being a flat shape now becomes an irregular shape by creating all these terraces. Now this is just one level. You can now go and actually do another level here and go even lower. So I'll show you how that is. So there's a very simple way to key a block mold and make it look clean and professional. Now I am speeding through this, otherwise I would take my time. A really good example of this type of key would be our toy car body that we made. So if you guys seen the video to this bad boy, here's the one part of the mold, and this is what sat on here. Now, all this used to be actually clay. And if you look closely, there is I know this is a little bit tough to see, I'm sorry about that, but there's a step key here that goes all around the model. So here I'm gonna show you maybe from an angle. So there's step keys also in the wheel wells. There's a good chance. So you can see it right there. Those are all step keys that help the two halves of the mold line up perfectly together. So when you look at this from, turn it, perfect. If you look at this above, all those keys are beveled at an angle so that the two halves of the mold come easily together and apart. If you want to see the clay up of this, check out the video on our video section or YouTube channel. A really interesting way of keying up larger pieces that you need to keep the dimensions on point as much as possible. A really nice example of that. Now let's just jump back into what we were doing earlier. Before I go on to more keys, I did want to get this set up for you guys and get it poured. I prepped this ahead of time so that we don't have to spend a lot of time. I'm going to put some gloves on. Whenever you're working with these products, it's good practice to protect yourself. So wearing gloves is part of it. And I have my little glue gun. Now this is a very simple block mold that we set up here. And I'm simply going to glue this together with some hot melt glue. Now the reason why I'm using plexiglass here is simply for you guys to be able to see into the mold. You can use all kinds of different materials for your mold boxes. Most important part is that they're not porous. Keep that in mind. Always keep the end result in mind. Porous surfaces should be sealed. So bare wood as a porous surface, that should be sealed. But otherwise, many different things are available and used for mold block walls. Gator board, plastics, what do you call it? So, a couple squirts of the hot glue. And there's my mold box. Keep in mind I'm rushing through this a little bit, otherwise I would usually take a little bit more time making sure to get these cleaner and just tighter. Keeping in mind that the cleaner your molds are, the cleaner castings you're going to produce out of them.
Somebody actually just asked about why you follow
Right, so we have a question that came in. Why do we follow the contours of the model? So just so you see this, there's a kind of a wave going on in that. That is, there you go, perfect, right there. So you see how that is not just flat, straight, it has a wave? Well, believe it or not, that becomes a key. It helps with the alignment of the two halves. You could cut that down just like I demonstrated earlier and create some step keys there. You don't have to do it just like this. There's many different approaches to these things. Different mold makers do different things differently. Why they do them that specifically, it's a proven technique to them. They tried it, they know it, that's what they do, and they stick to it. I'm just going to apply a little bit of release agent to my first half of the silicone mold. This release agent is a mixture of isopropyl alcohol and dish detergent. This is a technique that I learned in the foundry when I worked for casting of bronzes. We use this a lot as a release agent, and it's proven. I know it works, so that's what I like to stick with. And I'm just going to allow this to dry off for a little bit. Put my release agent away. And in the meantime, I can go ahead and start prepping my pouring material. Actually, I'm going to put some of these away out of my way because things are getting crowded. So, we're going to be pouring Mold Star 16 fast. A, B, B, A, I think like that. This is a fast setting silicone material. It has a working time of about 15 minutes and a cure time of about 30 minutes. Keep in mind that's going to differ somewhat based on your working conditions. If the material is warm, it's going to set up a little bit faster. If it's cold, it might set up a little bit slower. I'm just going to dispense this into my container, my mixing container.
How much alcohol did you put into that stuff?
Aha. Sorry, guys. So the question came up, how much alcohol versus the dish detergent did we put into that release agent? And sorry, I forgot to mention that. It's a mixed ratio of 4 parts isopropyl alcohol to 1 part dish detergent. Now, I like to use the Dawn dish detergent. Again, it goes to using something proven to work. I've been using this for years. I'm not going to switch now. It's a proven method that we used in the industry, and it worked for me. So that's just plain and simple. Check this out. So I have my material mixed together. Time is ticking. I'm trying to stir this. Holy smokes, that's a small mixing stick. Can't really work with that. So make sure you're working with the right tools for the materials that you're using. For the circumstance, it's not easy to mix something with a toothpick. So I'm using a larger mixing stick here. And you're going to hear me say this many, 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 many times. Scrape the sides, scrape the bottom of your mixing container. Make sure to mix thoroughly, but keep that working time in mind. So always scraping the sides, scraping the bottom of your mixing container. And because this is much important to me, I'm going to employ something called the double mix technique. It is the cheapest, easiest insurance that you have for mixing materials thoroughly. But always keep that working time in mind as you sometimes work with materials that cure faster, and sometimes with materials that have a slower cure time. So I'm going to transfer that into a secondary clean mixing container. And what's the reason for that? Again, it's that insurance, knowing that you mixed thoroughly. You see what I'm doing right now? I'm scraping the bottom of this container. And if there's any unmixed material there, it could end up in my mold So to prevent that, I transfer it into a clean mixing container and then mix it one more time. Again, scrape the sides, scrape the bottom. It's a really, really easy way to assure a good mixture. Now, once you have the material mixed thoroughly, you can go ahead and pour. Because I'm not using any pressure tanks, no vacuuming materials, I'm going to use something called high pour technique. Give me 1 second, I'll be right back. I'm just going to blow this really quick out. Sorry about that, guys, had to blow my nose. So we can go ahead and now pour the material into the second half of our mold. Because I don't use a pressure pot, I'm going to use something called needling technique, where you pour the material from up high, and you let it hit one spot, lowest spot in your mold. I'm going to find that. Let's see if I can aim. Boom. Oh, missed it. And you're going to pour that in a nice thin stream. Allow the material to travel around the model and push any kind of air bubbles away from the model on its own. You're not going to zigzag over the entire model. You're just going to hit one spot and let it fill up on its own. What's happening in this thin stream is that air bubbles are breaking. They're being stretched and are breaking in the pouring application. And actually here you're going to see why it's really important to double mix and mix thoroughly, because I'm using everything that's in this container and it's mixed up. We're pouring everything out. Now think if there's unmixed material, it would now end up in your mold, causing all kinds of issues down the line. So really easy, really simple to double mix, and it can save you a headache down the line. Now, this extra material now that's in there, we're going to scrape out, make sure it ends in our mold. Now, one thing that I find useful is to actually save the last mixing cup. This is going to be, so to say, my retainer material. If there's anything that goes wrong inside this mold, I can always go back and check if there's anything wrong inside the mixing cup. That's going to give you a better answer to what went wrong with your mold. Is there a problem with the layup? There's material that caused the inhibition. Is it your mixing? So if there's material cured here but not here, you get some idea of what went wrong. So I'm just going to move this aside to give us some working space. And then I really wanted to go ahead and touch up on a couple other key applications before pouring one of the figurines for you guys into molds. So again, going back to the mold keys, want to let you guys know that beyond block molds, you're going to be doing brush-on molds, you're going to be doing cavity pour molds, all kinds of molds that are going to require key applications. And some of those keys can be in support shells. Some of the keys can be inside the brushed-on rubber mold that holds onto the support shell. So there's all kinds of different key application, and while they might be a little bit more advanced, I did want to touch up on the topic because most likely you're going to encounter these sooner or later somewhere, or you're going to need to have an application like this. I'll talk about that in a second, and these bad boys as well. So, support shell material, brush-on molds. You're going to require keys that hold the rubber mold in place. Something that comes to my mind is brush-on molds that I do, where I separate the two halves in a nice clean channel. For that, I use these silicone channels that I make using these aluminum channels that you can purchase at a hardware store, any hardware store. Again, they come in different sizes, thicknesses, so don't be limited to just one. Choose based on your projects. It's good to have several sizes in your toolbox. Notice this one here. It says tin silicone. This one says urethane. So you want to label your tools so you don't end up inhibiting the materials that you're working with. Now, these keys, these silicone square tubes, usually I end up cutting them up into useful chunks. What you can do is you can cut them up into smaller pieces. I'll show you how I do that. When I cut these, I cut them at a bevel. So let's see, that's the clean edge. Always put the edge that's the pour edge of your keys, that's going to be your downward facing towards your mold. So we're going to put it towards that, and then we're going to cut the key at an angle in both directions. So what we have now is this V-shaped little strip. You see that? You see how it has the cuts going at an angle? That's what's going to be holding, these two angles are going to be holding the rubber mold in place. Now, I want to show you quickly an example of these used so you understand what's going on. Here's a brush-on mold that I made using the Rebound 40 and a support shell made out of freeform air. Really nice material. Love this stuff. You're going to see the keys right there, right there, right there, right there. And this is in the support shell. This is what they look like in the rubber mold. So you can see that V-shaped groove right there. See where my fingers are? See how it's shaped in a V? That's what's holding the support shell and the rubber together. So again, going back to the other side, flip over. See how those are held in place? They're not flopping downwards, even though the mold is upside down, whereby the other side, we're flopping, it's all over the place. So that's what holds the rubber in place here around the flange area. Again, going further into this mold, we have these silicone strips going along the entire perimeter where I plan to separate the mold in two. And what that does, it creates a nice clean registration all around my model. It helps that alignment of the two halves together. Once you put it back in, one side aligns perfectly inside the mold, and then the other side flops right back into that and then perfectly aligns in the other half of our support shell. Again, something that you will see in different industries, different mold makers are going to be employing these differently. Another thing that comes to mind where you're going to find these type of keys is life casting. So think about if you're doing a torso, you're doing a large piece where you have the front and your mold ends on the sides here. Those sides, the mold is going to want to flop inwards when you go to cast it. So these strips are used along the entire mold to hold it in the support shell. There is a video that came out recently on our channel about life casting. Check that out. They're definitely employed in there. Before we jump away from the silicone strips here, I did want to talk quickly about the keys in your support shell. Again, you're going to see different shapes of keys. Here we have a V groove. I'm going to turn this sideways. Perfect. You see that? That's my key that allows the other half off the support shell to basically find that groove and hold on to it perfectly to align my interior, the rubber mold that's important, perfectly. Those keys are embedded into our separation strip that goes along. Remember that separation strip that we added? That extra thick rubber? There it is. So there's that strip going around, and what I do is I slice a 4 to 5 millimeter groove into that rubber. Into that rubber, you insert aluminum shims. And again, I'm doing this just so you guys can see what's going on. So like that, you will insert aluminum shim, and then you build your mold, your support shell on top of that. Now, how do you get the key into your shim? Very simple. My mold making teacher at the foundry showed me this. So here are my keys made in aluminum shim. And the way they're made out of a aluminum shim is you simply fold it over onto itself. Don't press it hard here on this edge. You're gonna come back with your scissors, right on that edge where you just fold it over. And remember how deep you cut that rubber for these? That's how deep you're gonna make this cut. So for me, it's about 5 millimeters. You cut like that, then you cut it out. And that's how you remove that. See that? Now you go back into your key and you fold it out, basically folding it backwards, those wings. And that's how you make a very simple support shell key. Now this is inserted, this half is inserted into the rubber. And because you're inserting at about 5 millimeters, it's going to stop right at that edge. So very simple, easy way to make keys for rigid support shells. Another way to make keys in those support shells is clay. Going right back to our clay that we use. This is Sculptex. These are beveled keys that I already pre-made that are going to be going into our support shell. How do you make those? Really simple. Grab my painter's tool, my favorite, and then you're basically cutting the clay at a bevel. And you can make these as large or as small as needed. Keep in mind that the size of these will be determined by the size of the mold that you're making. So if you're making a mold of a T-Rex skull that's about 5 feet long, your keys are going to be different than if you're making a tiny little diver mold. So here you have a key. You can see that edges are beveled. And this is going to be applied to the support shell or to the parting line with the wider side down. That way the positive is fitting into the negative that you're going to be making over. A really good example of these being used is our Iron Man video for an Iron Man helmet. And I want to just show you quickly what that looks like inside the mold or on our support shell. So here, again, this is a little bit more advanced, but I wanted to expose you guys to it so you can understand what's going on. Here we have those keys in our rigid support shell. So that makes the two halves come together perfectly. See that? And that was made using those clay keys. Now you might say, holy smokes, that's a lot of keys on that mold. Look at that. You have round keys here. You have square ones down at the bottom holding the flange in. So heavily key mold, but they all serve their purpose. And just one more thing I want to show you here. You see how I embedded this key halfway into the support shell? So be creative when you make these. They don't have to be always one way, just in a rigid piece area. They can be right along the separation line. Now, how do I make these keys here? Let me show you. I just received a phone call from a customer 2 days ago who wanted to add keys to his rubber. They made this ginormous mold. It was something like 6 feet by 4 feet by 5 feet. And the rubber walls were so heavy that they were collapsing inward onto the casting itself, onto the mold itself. And he said to me, well, how can I add keys afterwards? It becomes a little bit more difficult, but it's the same application. They are V-shaped keys. So here, this is made out of Mold Star 30. It's a V-shaped cone. Again, that's what's going to be holding on to that support shell. This is going to be attached to the rubber mold, and the support shell is going to go right around the key, exposing the back of it so that you can press it in and out of your support shell. So let's see. Again, my model here, my Iron Man helmet. You have your key here, and because the back is exposed, you can simply push this in to get the piece out of your support shell. Now, when are those keys added to my brush-on mold? They're usually added second to last layer on the brush-on application. But just like my customer the other day already made a mold, what are you going to do then? You have to make holes in the support shell, attaching those keys in those areas. So it becomes much more difficult procedure if you don't plan ahead of time. Again, this is a little bit more advanced system, but I just wanted to show you these. Here is the keys that are casted in a, this is a, what do you call this stuff? Plaster, rigid plaster mold. 2-part rigid plaster mold with those cones inside. And the way that I designed this one is that it has a little tray. I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's actually tray inside here so that when I cast these keys, I can inlay a little piece of fabric, reinforcement fabric, that you're going to find. See that? And that just basically helps me when I'm attaching these keys now to the rubber mold. That helps with the attachment. When you put tension on there and you start pulling them, that reinforcement fabric is going to help. So those are locking mechanisms and keys for support shell. Now, you don't have to use little cups all the time. You can also use, what do you call them? Ice cube trays are great for these. And you just want to think about what are the keys used for. Are they used for alignment and face them downward with the wider edge down? Or are they used for holding things in place, in which case you're going to hold them upside down with the smaller end? So those are the type of things you want to determine beforehand. And just quickly, I wanted to show you here a cross section. I'm going to hold it against my apron, clearly visible there. So you see that V shape. That's the mechanism that holds the mold in the support shell. Well, let me know if you guys have questions on those. Again, those are a little bit more advanced, but sooner or later you will encounter them, and I'll rather have you guys be ready knowing what they are and how to employ them and how to use them. Move some of these aside, get us some more room. We got a couple more keys to get to. But before we do, I do want to go ahead and cast some material for you guys. I'm going to be casting into 2 molds. This is a mold that has no keys. This is a mold that has no air vents. So going back to that graphic that you guys saw earlier, this is a mold that has air vents in it. I can't see into this mold at all. I can see into this mold. So same object. 2 different setups. One has a air vent, the other one doesn't. I want to just quickly cast into that so you guys can see the outcome of those kinds of castings. Today we're going to be casting Smooth Cast 300. That is a urethane casting resin. It's bright white the way it is formulated. Has a working time of about 10 minutes, I believe, and cure of about 30. Keep in mind it's an exotherm product, so the more material you have in a single spot, the more mass you have, the faster it's going to set off. So the heat generated in the chemical reaction will set off the material faster. Now, I already pre-pigmented my smooth cast so that the casting coming out of this is going to be a nice gray instead of a bright white. I'm just going to wipe my little cup here. Now, this is a 1-to-1 mix ratio product, really easy to use. It's my number one go-to product when I need to make fast castings that are nice and clean. So I'm going to dispense my part B that's pre-pigmented with some So Strong black. Again, that's going to give us a gray color instead of a white. And then I'm going to add my part A. Once you add them two together, your time is ticking. I want to make sure that you mix thoroughly, but keep that working time in mind. Always, even with the casting resin and silicones, scrape the sides and scrape the bottom of the mixing container. Back and forth. And even though this looks pretty well mixed, I know personally from experience that usually it is not. It leaves all kinds of streaking. So I'm just going to continue turning this. You can see I'm turning with my hand while actually scraping the sides. And because this is really important to me, I'm going to double mix it. Again, keeping that working time in mind. I'm going to pour it into a secondary clean mixing container. A very cheap insurance to mixing well. Scrape the sides, scrape the bottom, continue doing that same thing. And then when you're mixed thoroughly, you can go ahead and pour the material into your molds. I'm not going to fill that up all the way just because I don't want that extra resin to sand off later, and I'm going to pour into the other one. And now I'm going to allow this to set up. I'm going to move these out of the way so we have a little bit more work space, but we'll get to them soon. Now, a couple other keys that I wanted to show you guys that you might not see in your everyday clay ups is these bubble sheets. They are usually seen in brush-on molds, against a little bit more advanced, but it's something that's available to mold makers out there, and I tend to use these on difficult to mold areas like between a arm and a torso, if you have any kind of open areas between the legs or figurines. This is what I use to block that space off. Once you make the two halves of your mold, you're actually making positive keys and negative keys on two halves. So when you take that mold apart, you remove your placeholder, you have two keys that now fit perfectly together. You have your positive and your negative that align perfectly, making sure that that area that you're casting is nicely aligned and minimizes any kind of cleanup work that you have to do. Again, a little bit more advanced, but it's out there. I wanted to show you guys so you understand what's going on. Now, here's one more mold that I wanted to show you. This is a block mold that I made earlier. It's the same diver guide that we have, but I used a mold knife to cut this open. We talked about these earlier. So this is cut with a mold knife, with this one specifically. And what happens is when you're cutting that, you're actually creating a groove and channel in your cuts. And I'm just going to let you guys see this and zoom in. So along here, you can see there's a ridge. I'm going to turn this a little bit. So there's a ridge here. Perfect. You see that against my finger? There's a little ridge that was cut into that side, while the opposite side received a channel. So here where my thumb is, you can see there's a channel going up. That's the channel created by that cut, by that mold knife. That's why you want to use a mold knife when you cut these open. Now, beyond using that mold knife for alignment, you can see why. You see how that fits perfectly together. There's my groove right here. And down here, you can see that they come perfectly together for a good alignment in your mold. Now, when you are cutting the side, you want to use a S shape or zigzag curve. So now you have double keys. You have keys going one way, aligning the mold this way, and you have keys going inside the mold and aligning it the other way. So now these two halves fit perfectly together, and once you strap them in, they're going to minimize that cleanup effort much along the seam lines on your mold. All right, so again, very easy to cut using the mold knife. Again, if you haven't seen how these are made, check out the video that we have posted on our website. So, and that pretty much brings us towards the end of our presentation. I'm going to show you guys the mold that we poured a couple minutes ago, and also the castings that we poured as they're curing up. I'm going to throw a couple other examples on you guys just so you can see what's out there and what you can encounter when you start making these things. Here is, again, another brush-on mold that I did. This is freeform air. You can see the keys that we have here, helping our mold line up perfectly. I also made a stand so that we can easily stand our mold up. But the reason why I pulled this mold out, I wanted to show you the flange here. You can see that there's keys holding that flange in place when you go to use it. And the way that was done is the silicone itself, I'm going to take this out. When I finished my mold in silicone, I went ahead and I cut the flange with keys in them. And if you notice, they're shaped, again, in that angle cut, so that these can hold the rubber mold in place. Right here you can see, again, my little separation channel that I made out of silicone, and the cut that was made in the silicone to hold the shims that created our keys and the separation line between the two halves. So, you know, with all these techniques, keys, vents, and air spouts, pour spouts shown, one thing to keep in mind that everybody's going to make these a little different. See what's out there. Copy another mold maker. See what I've done here and try to use them on your own molds. That's going to create a much better castings and much better, cleaner molds that you can then use in your casting procedure. So again, just a nice simple mold there. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention here towards the end of our presentation is that everything that I showed you here is not really any guarantee that you're going to get perfect castings out of your molds. It's a learning process. So if you discover stuff that doesn't work for you, try to change it. Try to alter it. What other people are doing. See what others are doing. Ask questions. Again, we're here to help. You can always voice your questions to us. And then we'll chime in and let you know what we think of the layup or the setup and what you could do better. Now, going back to the beginning and understanding that you can always adjust your mold somewhat. If you seem that there's not enough air coming out of the mold, or it's a difficult area on the elbow or somewhere else on the piece, You can always add additional vents to it. There's nothing wrong with that. You're changing the mold a little bit to make it perform better. You know? And again, keep your questions coming if you have them. We're actually pretty ready to peel this apart. This is our two-part mold that we poured earlier. We didn't cast it, we poured it. The second half has set up. Again, this is fast setting material. Understand the material that you're working with. I'm going to just break this open to retrieve our casting. There we go again, casting. It's a mold. The terminology in the mold making and casting world can be very vast and confusing, and I catch people saying the wrong things all the time. They say mold for a casting and a casting for a mold. Sometimes you have just too much information in your head and it just comes out the wrong way. But we are pouring a mold here, or have poured a mold, and we're ready to demold it. Again, this is speed molding, speed demolding. I'm not even going to clean up the edges here. I'm just going to pop this mold open here. And there you go. I'm going to pull that model out. Remove some of that silicone, get our pour spout out. Any of the extra silicone can easily be just pulled away because it's still fresh. And now I want to show you guys what I meant by, actually I'm going to cut that off because it's a little thicker on the end there. But what I wanted to focus on in this mold is now, remember how we cut the air vent on this side in? Now those air vents and keys are positives on our second half. So here you can see the keys are positive and we have our little air vents. Now the keys we're going to leave alone because they register into the negative on the other side. But the air vents themselves, those do need to be removed. So we're going right back into our little knife setup. And I'm going to use one of these knives and now remove that positive channel. So whatever was poured in there is now positive, gets removed, and we actually make a new channel. So that positive part basically was a guideline, if you want to call it that, where to place the other half or where to remove the other half. Again, terminology in these things can be very different based on who is talking, what kind of experience they have with these things, and what makes sense to them in their mind. So we have removed one here. Now we're going to switch over to the other side. Again, going back right to that elbow, we added that as well. So we're going to start with the elbow vent. I'm going to remove that. And then we're removing the other one that's going to the dagger, to the knife. And clean the top. And there you have it. We added those vents after we made the first half of our rubber mold. And because we added the keys as well, this mold registers now much better together. You can see here, those are the additional keys we cut out. And here's that uneven line that we talked about earlier, we had a question about. So you can see how that becomes a locking mechanism as well for your mold. The more irregular your mold halves are, where they come together, the better casting you're usually going to see in your castings. And speaking of that, I did want to show you two more molds. I promise after that it's over. This mold right here is quite neat. It's a model horse. So we got a little horsey. When we went to mold it, we had to figure out how to mold it, which way to pour the material from, and you can pretty much see the result of that. We decided to pour it upside down, where the pour spouts are going to be the legs themselves. So the legs become the pour spouts for the material to feed into the mold. Now, where did we need an air vent? We needed an air vent here at the snout going up. We needed one at the belly going up. And we needed one at the tail. And you can actually see the one at the tail was cut in here. These other ones you can't really see clearly anymore because this is an older mold. But this mold was cut in half, and you can see how irregular the cuts are. The lines are not straight. They're zigzag back and forth. You see that? It was zag, 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 zag. So all that makes it fit together better. I know this is kind of hard to see, but there's all kinds of cut marks and uneven ridges in here. See that? So all that makes for better alignment between the two halves of our casting. Now the same mold was created, but this time, you see how we cut it? Again, that cut, that zigzag in a cut, creates a much better alignment between the two halves. But instead of cutting the entire mold apart, you can see that the bottom is intact and actually holds the mold together. Nice. The bottom, the back of the mold was not cut. And the reason for that is to minimize any kind of seam line that's going to be most visible on your casting. So we eliminated the seam line on the back here and hid the seam line down below where it's not as visible. This goes along the line of keeping the end result in mind as far as what you want to do, what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to hide in your molds, in your castings. You always try to put the separation line in the least visible places on your model. That way it's well hidden and you have to do much less to actually finish the piece, hide the separation line, and get your piece, your casting presentable. Now I'm going to check and see if our castings have cured up. So here we have our MoldStar 15 mold, poured at the same time, same material. I'm just going to break this open, and you can see that we have a good casting. Even though the air vents are connected right to the pour spout, to the base of our piece, we still got a good casting. There is not air trapment, and we got a good casting that's useful. Now, our other mold that had no air vents, and keep in mind the only reason I made this clear is so you guys can see into it as we're casting into it. Actually, this one, somebody cut an air vent in here and actually got a good casting out of it. I wonder who that was. Probably me. So anyways, the casting that came out of this mold before the air vent was cut is this one right here, and I saved it specifically because there was no hand, no arm here, but I forgot I ended up cutting a vent into that one. So, but there it is. That pretty much closes up our presentation. I want to thank you guys for joining us here live today. I welcome your questions. Make sure you voice them. Let us know. If we don't answer them live here, we will try to answer as much as we can, or just go online and submit a tech ticket form that can explain your project a little bit more into detail. Now, I would like you guys to let us know where you're from. Which side of the continent, of the world you're making molds and castings in, and encourage you guys to visit our videos and our tech support line. And of course, if you need any kind of materials, make sure that you reach out either to us directly or any one of our distributors around the world. Now, if you have an idea about the next presentation we should do, please let us know. This is driven by you guys. We try to address topics that are interesting, important, and educational. So let us know what you like to see, and we'll try to follow up on that. With that, I want to say goodbye, and thanks again. Bye-bye.